The following program has been pre-recorded, so please don't call in at this time. If you'd like to participate in A Pause for Thought, tune in on Wednesdays at 5 p.m. on Baton Rouge Community Radio. Good evening, fellow humans. This is Wayne Parker with A Pause for Thought here on Baton Rouge Community Radio. 96.9 FM here in Baton Rouge. Well, I'm sure glad to be here. I'm sure you all are too. I'd like to remind all the listeners that this is a live call-in show. Feel free to call in and share your comments on questions, add information, correct me, or even poke fun at me. 343-9927 is the number to call, 343-9927. Give us a call regarding the topic of the evening, and the topic of the evening involves a guest. She is originally from Baton Rouge, has majored in Earth and Environmental Sciences at Furman University. She's worked as a research assistant in coastal Louisiana, and let's see, most recently she has worked in Alaska on visitor and resource management issues at a national park. And so let's see, when it comes to huge environmental challenges like Louisiana's coastal land loss or global climate change, she says she wants people to be informed and empowered so that we can start addressing these issues. And she personally hopes to go to grad school in environmental science or in natural resource management. And I certainly hope she is successful in doing everything she wants to do. Please welcome Amanda Ritchie. Amanda?
Good to be here.
Okay, good to be here. Good to have you here. Okay, you were in Alaska recently. How long ago?
Yeah, so I was in Alaska from March to September of this year.
Okay, so you just came back fairly recently.
Yep.
And were you doing environmental work there, or obviously you were directly involved with the environment because that's pretty much all Alaska is.
Yeah, just beautiful wilderness up there. So I was kind of involved with environmental issues, but more with visitor management in a national park. But up there I got to see climate change firsthand, really.
How so?
Well, the Arctic and subarctic are warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. So those effects were really obvious. It was the warmest summer on record for Alaska. Anchorage had a 90-degree day, which, you know, is fairly common down here, but unheard of up there.
Yeah. And of course, we know that the polar ice cap on the North Pole, anyway, is shrinking, and that's been happening for a long time. I recall reading back in the 80s, I think, that the northern European countries were already negotiating and signing treaties for navigation rights for when the global ice cap melted and they could send ships through there. So, yeah, that's happening there. And you had mentioned a lot of wildfires, too, up there, didn't you?
Yeah, there were over 100 this summer. And, I mean, hiking around where I was, you could feel it. There were smoke everywhere. There were fires all over the place. Now,
a friend of mine asked me that today when I was telling him about this show, and he says, well, could that be a cyclical thing, the forest fires? I mean, you mentioned something when we were talking the other day about, you know, getting ready for the show, that their rainy season was not. And so tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so normally in the summer, at least in interior Alaska, it's supposed to rain kind of like a gentle mist all the time, and for 2 months straight it didn't rain at all. And then it rained for 10 days straight, and it became the wettest summer on record. So the climate patterns, the weather patterns were definitely shifting. Yeah,
and of course we're seeing that here in Louisiana too, and elsewhere. I mean, we have had droughts out in the Midwest, and of course then the fires and all that, but and the severe storms throughout the Midwest and the Northeast. So the climate is definitely changing, and probably not for the better.
Yeah, well, I mean, even this summer, the spring flood that came a couple of months late with the Bonnie Carey spillway opening.
I forgot about that, yes.
Yeah, and then Hurricane Barry coming at the same time.
Yeah, that could have been a real bad catastrophe, and yeah, that's a whole other issue there, the levee system and all that. We could probably do another show just on that. Okay, we mainly wanted to, now that we've talked a little bit about the environment, let's not change the subject and talk about Greta Thunberg. What's she all about? She, for what I've seen, she's just this precocious little kid who thinks she's important.
Well, I would disagree. I think she's a really interesting figure. She's garnered tons of support all over the world to bring attention to the climate crisis, but I don't understand why she's a polarizing figure. So that's really what I want to talk about tonight. She started striking for climate change a little over a year ago, August 2018.
How was she striking? Just going out and standing in an intersection and blocking traffic, or what?
No, so she's from Sweden. She would sit outside the Swedish parliament with a sign for hours a day, every single day in August. And then she eventually shifted to going back to school, and she would just strike outside the Swedish parliament only on Fridays.
Mm-hmm. Okay. With her signs and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Did anybody in the government ever pay attention to her?
Honestly, I don't know. I know that she's known the world over, and Time magazine named her one of the most influential teens. But
well, that right there would probably make her polarizing, because, you know, you've got people on one side of an issue and people on the other, and if you're out there in the lead somewhere and being prominent about it.
Yeah.
But anyway,
you're going to garner some criticism.
Right. So what has she done since then? I mean, obviously we're not here to talk about her protests on Friday afternoons outside of the Parliament.
Yeah, well, we kind of are, but we're more, I guess, talking about how much she's changed in a year.
Right. What has she accomplished?
Yeah, she was all by herself for months, and then now she's got a movement of about 4 million people standing behind her, also striking for climate change action. And she's got some criticism about how she doesn't ever talk about solutions, and how she's just, you know, maybe whining to adults about, you have to do this thing. But I think it's really inspiring that she's mobilized so many people to talk about the issue.
Yeah, you know, I read, we both read about the mural that was painted of her up in Canada, in Edmonton, I think, that was vandalized. But yeah, and that was one of the criticisms that was painted on the sign, on the mural, was that, you know, come up with some solutions. And do you think that's necessarily a valid criticism of her?
I think it is a valid criticism, but I think she's not necessarily about basically lecturing people on, well, she is about lecturing people on climate change, but more about the need for action on climate change. In one of her speeches that she gave last year, she said, "Some people say that I should be in school. Some people say that I should study to become a climate scientist so that I can solve the climate crisis. But the climate crisis has already been solved. We already have all the facts and all the solutions. We just need to wake up and change."
Yeah, and actually with what I see is nobody's doing anything about it right now, really, not much, not seriously. Our government certainly isn't. China certainly isn't. And we're the biggest emitters of carbon dioxide in the world. So if we were able to get everybody to strike, that would get the government's attention. And they could do something, you know, I mean, there would be ways, I presume. But regarding solutions also, I thought of something. People, when they say we want some solutions, like the people in Edmonton, that's oil country. That's what this one person said. And they wrote, come up with some solutions instead of whining. And I thought, well, yeah, you know, there are other solutions besides cutting global warming. Yeah, we gotta cut fossil fuel consumption a great deal. So maybe a solution would be government funding and retraining for people who lose their jobs from fossil fuel industries. And
exactly.
You know, while we also reduce carbon emissions, you know. That might be something, because that's what those people are worried about. That's what the people in Louisiana are worried about. You know, oil's our livelihood. You know, it keeps everything going, and that's a real concern, really. I mean, what's the point in starving everybody today, if you know, so the world can be better tomorrow? You know.
Well, I don't think it's a matter of starving, for one thing. I think it's a matter of shifting how you live your life a little bit, but like you said, there can be support for that shift.
Right, yeah, and that's really what I was getting at, is, like, you know, people are afraid of being unemployed and having to live under a bridge or whatever, you know, and they don't...
I don't think it's that drastic.
Well, that's what people think, though. I mean, I wouldn't want to lose my job right now, you know, so... because I couldn't make money doing radio, that's for sure. Anyway, I want to remind the listeners you're listening to Wayne Parker on A Pause for Thought, 343-9927, 343-9927. I'm speaking with a young climate scientist, Amanda Ritchie, who's here.
Not a climate scientist, just an environmentalist.
Environmentalist, pardon me, and thank you for the correction. But she is somebody who knows a whole lot more about the environment than I do, so how about that? 343-9927. Feel free to give us a call and ask questions or add your own input or just voice your opinion. 343-9927. Okay, you had a quote from a famous American you wanted to share regarding Greta?
Yeah.
Greta Thunberg, right?
Yes.
Okay.
So the quote's from Theodore Roosevelt. It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while doing greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat.
Well.
And I think this quote is kind of indicative of how I feel about Greta Thunberg. She might not be doing it perfectly, but she's doing something about climate change, and I really respect that.
Okay, well, no, and I agree. How much of a struggle is this really for her, though? And I'm curious.
No, that's a good point. Well, what do you mean by how much of a struggle is it?
Well, is she having to scrape her pennies together to fly around the world and,
She doesn't, but she also doesn't fly.
Because airlines are...
Because of the carbon intensity.
And that was why she took the ship across the Atlantic, and that was one of the things that she was criticized for by one of these critics who called her just a kid who was...
publicity stunt or whatever.
Right, and she didn't really know anything about the environment. She was doing just saying what her parents told her. I mean, that was what the criticism was. And how would you address that?
I would say that if she weren't completely committed to this, she wouldn't basically put herself in the firing line to get all this criticism the world over. I think it might not be as much of a struggle as someone who's living in sub-Saharan Africa to talk about climate change, but she's still doing something with the resources that she has to bring attention to this global issue.
Well, and the way I would have answered that, and I'm not trying to, one-up you, but I thought about this too, and it's like, oh dear, I'm 62 years old. It just flew away. We were talking about why she's doing it, or whether or not she knew what she was talking about. I don't think that's the point. The point is, climate change is happening, and the point is, the governments aren't doing enough. So whether she knows a lot about the science of climate change or not, she's still doing what needs to be done, calling attention to it and causing trouble, basically, to get people's attention.
Making sure people think about it. Because right now, people I feel like everyone knows about climate change, and whether they're actively denying it or not, no one's really doing anything to address it. Right.
And I know people who are denying it. It's embarrassing to say that I know people. I don't hang around with them, but I do know them. And there's an article here. Oh, that's something I want to ask you real quickly. This is from the 360, which is a United Kingdom publication, apparently. They talk about the Extinction Rebellion, and that preceded, I think, Greta Thunberg, right?
Yeah. Well, there have been tons of. There's a history of, climate strike and climate activism, environmental justice activism, too. And I don't think Greta's necessarily stealing their thunder, but she is bringing more attention to the issues.
Sure. Well, you were mentioning, I think I read a number of 4 million people all over the world
participated last month. Yeah. So, for those who don't know, this movement that Greta started last year is called Fridays for Future, and it coincides with the school strike for climate. So the last big global strike was September 23rd, about a month ago. The next one is scheduled for November. It's November 29th.
Okay, and getting back to this article on the Extinction Rebellion, and this relates to what Greta is doing. They called attention to the question here. A poll in July revealed that climate is a top priority for Britons, with 71% of the public saying it is more pressing long-term issue than Brexit. But while many people may be sympathetic to the rebellion's cause, there is evidence that the protesters are antagonizing the very people they are trying to get on their side. Businesses, commuters, and workers have endured delays and costs to their livelihoods, while ambulances face blocked roads, long lines of traffic, and they're upset about that, and they're angry at the protesters. And my thought was, well, then maybe they should join the movement, and because really, if businesses, the people that actually create the wealth in this world, working people, if they were to start striking for climate change, that would get people's attention.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, and Greta is kind of enforcing that choice on people, or forcing that acknowledgement anyway.
Yeah, I think talking about the Extinction Rebellion and if their methods are effective or not raises a broader question about what the point of climate strikes are and if they're actually effective at accomplishing goals. So yes, everyone's talking about climate change now, but has it changed anything? And I think that's a broader question about how to act in an era of climate change.
Yeah, and I've been through some parts of the Midwest, Texas, Oklahoma, and even in Pennsylvania. They have wind turbines in a lot of places. I think Germany supplies 30% of its power with green energy. Do you know that?
I don't know about Germany, but I know that France, more than half of their energy comes from nuclear. So it's not unheard of to, power a nation without relying entirely on fossil fuels.
Right, yeah, and of course nuclear has its own problems too with the spent nuclear fuel, but that aside, that is something that can be processed and reduced, whereas if you destroy the climate, you're not going to fix that. You won't be around. We won't be around to fix it.
Well,
at least I won't.
Yeah, I'll probably still be here, but
so what are some of the consequences of global change or global climate change that you could talk about? We've seen more severe rainstorms here in Louisiana.
Mm-hmm. We've seen earlier and more intense snow melt, and because of that, the Mississippi River rises.
Good point. Yes, and then we had that, like you said, last spring. We had the river was up, and the Bonacary Spillway was open, I think, for a record
number of days.
Record number of days straight. Yeah, and that, of course, had an environmental impact on the fishing industry and the oyster industry, because all that fresh water went out there and killed off a lot of stuff. And that'll be followed up by the dead zone in the spring after all the fertilizing is done in the cornfields and whatnot. So
yeah, it's a connected system. We're not just going to see. We will see localized effects, right, with changing weather patterns, but particularly in Louisiana, you can't ignore the fact that we're connected to broader systems. So everything coming down the Mississippi is going to affect us.
Yes, indeed. Yes, it is, one way or another. And I want to remind the listeners right now, you're listening to Wayne Parker on A Pause for Thought. I'm speaking with client. Call yourself out. It's gone. Go ahead.
Yeah, Amanda Ritchie, environmentalist.
Amanda Ritchie, a young lady who knows a whole lot more about the environment than I do. She's an environmentalist. 343-9927 is the number to call. 343-9927. Call in and share your topic, your ideas or questions on the topic of the evening, which is Greta Thunberg and her climate movement and climate change in general. Let's see here. You mentioned the fires up in Alaska. Haven't there also been a lot of fires in Greenland? Mm-hmm. Greenland's covered by ice, though, isn't it?
Not throughout the year. So that raises a good point about permafrost. Some people, when they hear permafrost, just think of, snow covering a landscape. But that's not necessarily the case. So permafrost is soil that is frozen for at least 2 years straight. And another effect that I saw in Alaska was that with the 2 months straight of record warm, record dry temperatures and weather patterns, a lot of the permafrost was thawing, and there were landslides in the park because of the permafrost thaw.
Wow, yeah, wow. That's well, how deep normally is the permafrost? I think I've heard it goes down like 18 inches or something like that in the real cold places.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, you can get permafrost that's feet deep.
Wow.
So it's fascinating, really, what that does to a landscape.
Yeah, we're talking mud, major mud, really. And there's also another problem, too, that was just kind of discovered, I guess, 2 or 3 years ago. There are bubbles of methane that have been trapped probably for thousands of years in the permafrost. And as the permafrost has been thawing, this gas has expanded because it was getting warmer and would explode and leave huge craters. And then they've done it over in Siberia. And I just learned recently that they've found several huge craters on the bottom of the Arctic Ocean where this has happened, where, you know, huge bubbles have blown up, basically, and come to the surface.
Yeah, I remember reading a couple years ago, too, that old diseases that we thought were gone lay dormant in frozen soil, and now that the soil is thawing and heating up, those diseases are coming back out.
I hadn't heard that one, but...
Yeah, I'll have to look it up and send you a link.
Yeah, and I believe you. I'm like, oh, no, not another problem, you know, associated with climate change.
Yeah.
But getting back to the fires, though, what's burning in Iceland?
In Iceland or in Greenland?
Greenland,
or in
sorry.
So I can't really speak too much about Greenland, or Iceland for that matter, but in Alaska, there's forest, there's 100-year-old, 200-year-old forest that's burning. Also, in some places, the soil is really carbon-rich, so the soil itself will start to burn, and then it'll take a long time to put that out, too.
And that was something I read about the fires in Greenland, was that the permafrost was warming up, and there was decayed or maybe carbon-based soil that was exposed, and that was what was burning, because the fires, I think this year the fires have been the worst they've ever been in Greenland, have they not? Oh, okay. I thought I saw something on that earlier. But anyway, okay, so there's those fires there, and we know the Arctic ice cap is definitely shrinking. Our glaciers are disappearing.
I believe it was this summer, but in Iceland, there was a memorial service for a glacier. A plaque went up next to this glacier that had disappeared, and the plaque basically read, "To the future, you'll know if we solved this or not. To whoever's reading this in the year 2050, you will know if we actually banded together to solve climate change."
Right. Yeah, I've seen pictures of glaciers, you know, like time sequence photos over a few decades, and within the past few years, they went from these huge masses of ice down to next to nothing. And so, do you think we're going to solve all these things?
Well, we need to band together and make major changes within 10 years. So, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change last year released a report that said the global average, global temperature average, could reach a threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius, or about 3 degrees Fahrenheit, above pre-industrial levels by as early as 2030. And that sounds like a bunch of scientific mumbo-jumbo, but what that really means is climate change in some places is already here, and we've got a deadline to solve it, and it's 2030.
Right, and I guess, if I'm understanding this correctly, are they taking into account all of the carbon dioxide that has yet to have an effect?
That's already released?
Yeah.
I don't know if they did in that report, but I'm sure it was accounted for.
Well, okay, because, I've read where even if we cut all emissions to zero right now...
there's still a lag.
We're still going to have temperature going up. So.
Yeah, and we're still going to see ocean acidification and sea level rise.
Yes. And sea level is rising. We've had, as a matter of fact, Rolling Stone magazine a year or two ago pointed out that the Norfolk Navy shipyard, naval station, has been under a couple of feet of water a couple of times, our administration buildings. And the Navy, the U.S. Department of Defense has declared climate change a national security risk.
Yeah,
but
in
yet,
2015, it was declared.
Oh, yeah. Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, a threat multiplier.
But it's like, okay, so why aren't we taking this seriously then? You know, it's, and I have to believe it's fear on the politicians' part. I mean, it's human beings' inertia, I guess. I mean, and you can't really grasp it, you can't see it. Most people don't live in Norfolk, you know, or don't live in the coasters, so they don't really recognize the problem. But yeah, you know, it seems daunting to me to get them to take action.
Well, I think there's almost paralysis. So either you reconcile what's actually happening. I mean, there's research that shows that climate scientists have PTSD or PTSD-like effects from researching climate change. So either you grapple with what's happening or you just ignore it and go along with your life. If you grapple with what's happening, then you can become paralyzed with fear. Like, there's so much that's going on. How can one person fix it?
Right. Yeah, I doubt that's the problem with politicians, though, because they probably don't know all that much about it. I guess just my cynical opinion, I suppose. But yeah, I can imagine somebody who really, really cares, you know, would be shocked and even suffer PTSD or whatever. Because it is surprising to learn these things. You kind of bummed me out when you mentioned about the old diseases that have been frozen.
Yeah.
You know, it's like chances are humanity had never even had a chance to see those diseases because those areas have always been frozen over since there's been humanity. So we have no immune system for them. We have no antibodies or anything. And then, you know, too, something else I was thinking of earlier when you were talking about that, the warming of the oceans or the changing of the temperature patterns in the oceans is causing species to migrate into areas that they never were in before. And they're displacing or killing off the native species in those areas. And of course, the Great Barrier Reef is dying.
Yeah.
Reefs all over the world are dying as a result of the increased acidity and also the increase in temperature in the oceans. So
yeah, I mean, global climate change is affecting literally everything on Earth, and I think it's loops back to the question about what can we as citizens do, and again, back to Greta Thunberg, she is one person who's doing all she can, or at least all she believes she can do right now to bring attention to it.
Yeah, all she can do. And really, that's really all any of us can do is what we can do, you know, and just do the best you can and try not to get too wrapped up in the end results, I guess. I mean, I learned that just with age. It's like, well, wait a minute, I'm not going to solve the world's problems. I'm not going to save the country at that time from the dad-burn liberals, but I can at least influence people immediately around me. And you know, and if we all did that, and Greta, I'm sure, is whether she realizes it or not, if there is an effect from her efforts, it will be because of that. She's making more and more people aware of it. Yeah. Maybe people will start.
And she's forcing people to talk about it, too. I mean, would we be having this conversation if she weren't striking every single Friday?
Good point. Good point. Oh, you know, that's something I thought of earlier, and I've thought of it many times, actually. You mentioned the International Climate...
Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change?
Thank you, yeah. That body of scientists that knows all this stuff. I'm making fun of myself, but, you know, anyway. I've often wondered, with all these deniers out there, and I believe ExxonMobil, a major corporation, sorry. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to publicly criticize them or not. Well, we are volunteer radio, so yeah, I'll say it.
Yep.
ExxonMobil has just gone to court, I believe, for deliberately passing misinformation. I mean, actively putting out misinformation regarding global warming due to fossil fuel and carbon dioxide. And so that's, you know, that's a help there, I guess. But I lost my point again. But
yeah, I think something else to talk about is how there are different ways to address it. So there's, you know, like the immediate gratification of striking or marching or doing some kind of activism. But there's also battles in the courts. There's coalitions of businesses that are coming together saying, hey, if we don't solve climate change, there goes our business.
Right.
So it's not an either or. You can do a lot of things. Or I would like to think that people, if they want to get involved, can do a lot of things.
Right, and the point I was going to make before it flew away with ExxonMobil was that with this intergovernmental panel on climate change, why don't we have a public debate where the so-called scientists that deny it and the scientists that claim it's occurring face off and show their sources and get this debate settled? We never see that, and it's like, that there's all this, and it could be because corporate media, are holding back on that because their sponsors, benefit from the fossil. I don't know, but it just seems to me that they could have a serious debate on worldwide television about this with the deniers brought out there in front of everybody and be forced to back up what they're saying.
Well, I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon, but that makes me think of the Ken Ham-Bill Nye debate on creationism and evolution, and how, I don't know if you saw it, but that was kind of a lose-lose, it seemed like to me, because on the one hand, you're acknowledging something that's just scientifically not true and bringing it to a level of like equivalent
worthy of
with
debate.
science. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I think it is, but anyway, we got to stop here. Amanda, I almost called you Greta. I guess that would have been flattering, right? But you've been listening to Wayne Parker on A Pause for Thought. I've been speaking with Amanda Ritchie, an environmentalist, here on A Pause for Thought. And we are out of time. We got to go. You have a good night.